Welcome to Liberty.me Studio. Be part of the global Liberty community at Liberty.me. Liberty lives here.
In part one of this two-part podcast episode, I provided some basic biographical information about the man known today in English-speaking countries as Max Stirner. I left off with his marriage to Marie Dainhart, the young woman with advanced opinions and a substantial chunk of change from an inheritance, whom he had met and wooed and won at Hippel's Wine Bar, the place where Die Freien, the so-called left Hegelians, met and argued philosophy, economics, theology, and politics almost nightly. Stirner dedicated his one book, The Ego and Its Own, to my sweetheart, Marie Dainhart. A shadow of doubt has fallen over this public face of connubial bliss, however. When, in the 1890s, John Henry Mackay was researching the only biography of Max Stirner that has ever been written, it was first published more than a century ago in 1904, he discovered to his astonishment that Marie Dainhart was still living and could be contacted in London. He wrote to her in a state of excited expectation. What would she be able to reveal about the private life and personal qualities of a man she had known for only a few years many decades before, but with whom she had been on familiar and intimate terms, living and sleeping together? To his shock and dismay, she replied with apparent indignation that she had no interest whatever in discussing Stirner, whom she had neither loved nor respected. She told Mackay further that Stirner had never had any real friends, because he was too selfish to maintain relationships with anybody else. She added that she had found him very sly. And, of course, Mackay already knew that she had left Stirner and moved to England after only 2.5 years of marriage. The influential American journalist and critic James Gibbons Huneker, in a lengthy review essay on the first English-language edition of The Ego and Its Own that ran in June 1907 in the North American Review, put things even more plainly and straightforwardly, even bluntly. Stirner, he wrote, was poor, a failure, and despised by his wife. He lived under a dull, brutal regime. The individual was naught, the state all. His book was his great revenge. It was the efflorescence of his ego. It was his romance, his dream of an ideal world, his Platonic republic. Philosophy is more a matter of man's temperament than some suppose. I am unique. Never again will this aggregation of atoms stand on earth. Therefore, I must be free. I will myself free. But Stirner did not will himself irresponsible in the process. As Huneker put it, the increased self-responsibility of life in an egoist union would prevent the world from ever entering into such ideal anarchy. There is reason to quibble about Huneker's description of Stirner's home life, to be sure. In what sense, for example, was he a failure? During most of the time he was writing The Ego and Its Own, he was teaching at the private prep school for girls. And once he married Marie in the fall of 1843, still some months before he completed his manuscript, the two of them had not only his salary as a teacher, but also her substantial inheritance to live on. And all this is to say nothing of the journalism Stirner had been actively committing on the side for more than a year before he married Marie, and went on committing throughout their brief marriage. That surely brought in some additional money, howsoever meager it might have been. After he quit his teaching job in the fall of 1844, apparently because he believed that his book was going to propel him to literary fame and the attendant riches, Things did go rather less well for Stirner and his wife. Her inheritance began dwindling rapidly once the couple had nothing but his journalism to fall back on, and after he lost all that was left of that inheritance by investing it, apparently with her permission, in a dairy that promptly folded, she decided enough was enough and departed for London. He remained in Berlin. Now, perhaps a year and a half after the publication of The Ego and Its Own, he could be reasonably described as a poverty-stricken failure who was despised by his wife, and things never got any better for him again. He plugged along for a few years, doing freelance editing and translation, and continuing to contribute articles to newspapers and magazines. He translated the works of Adam Smith and Jean-Baptiste Say into German. He edited a 2-volume anthology of essays by other writers and called it The History of Reaction. None of this work paid very well, nor did the resulting books sell very well. Gradually, he stopped writing, or at least he stopped publishing. Perhaps for a while Stirner went on writing, but could no longer find anyone willing to publish what he wrote. It is useful in this connection to recall that 1848, the second year of Stirner's feeble attempt to live decently without teaching and without Marie, was also the year of revolution in Central and Western Europe. It saw uprisings and insurrections against long-established monarchies, whose strength the rebels had sorely underestimated. By early 1849, the monarchists had routed the revolutionaries and killed, locked up, or exiled most of the politicians and writers who had whipped up support for them. The revolutionaries were a loose coalition of bourgeois and working-class elements, some of them seeking liberal reforms, others seeking socialist reforms. Any writer of the time who dared to express any political opinion that didn't strike the ruling class as monarchist enough was liable to be arrested, particularly if he expressed himself as forcefully as Stirner was wont to do. Stirner was already on record in The Ego and Its Own as an implacable enemy of the state, any state. Prudence would seem to have dictated his falling silent in such circumstances, as it would doubtless have seemed prudent to any printers who might otherwise have been tempted to publish his writing. On the other hand, perhaps not. After all, a portion of the first edition had been seized in Leipzig, in the nearby German-speaking kingdom of Saxony, by agents of the state censor's office. But, as David Leopold reports in his introduction to the most recent English-language edition of The Ego and Its Own, the one published by Cambridge University Press, the Saxon Minister for the Interior ordered the release of the confiscated copies on the grounds that the book was too absurd to constitute a danger to social or political order. In any case, though, the Saxon minister was the first to call Stirner's book absurd, but he was far from the last. Less than half a century later, the American anarchist Victor Yaros publicly repudiated his own brief fling with Stirner's ideas, which he called monstrously absurd and miserably nonsensical. He advised the readers of his public mea culpa to disregard his writings of the previous 2 years, which had been tainted by the metaphysical and fallacious conclusions on display in The Ego and Its Own. 80 years later, an English professor of education, he later switched over to philosophy, R.W.K. Patterson, suggested a bit more gently that perhaps we are not intended to take Stirner's philosophy seriously, for Stirner's system is riddled with paradoxes of self-reference, and the system as a whole might be said to enshrine a version of the paradox of the liar. Patterson wondered if the question of the whole system's objective truth or falsehood was a strictly senseless question. Nor is it only the paradoxical nature of Stirner's philosophy that gives rise to such suspicions as Patterson's. There's also the radically unorthodox manner in which Stirner has chosen to present his ideas. David Leopold calls the style in which Stirner wrote The Ego and Its Own highly idiosyncratic and somewhat relentless. In fact, Leopold asserts, almost every feature of his writing seems calculated to unnerve. The use of aphorism and metaphor, the neologisms, the mixture of self-consciously obscure terminology with colloquial language, the excessive italicization and hyperbole, all confound the received framework in which philosophical argument is conducted. On the other hand, it has not gone unnoticed that there is very little in the way of philosophical argument in The Ego and Its Own. Leopold writes of Stirner's characteristic method of proceeding by assertion rather than argument, in order to insist on rather than demonstrate a claim. He notes also that images do as much work as arguments in Stirner's text. George Woodcock concurs. Stirner, he writes in his classic 1962 book, Anarchism, A History of Libertarian Ideas and Movements, always prefers aphorism to argument. Still, Stirner's unconventional style as a philosopher poses probably a lesser impediment to the reading enjoyment of the average curious 21st century mind than his maddening habit of devoting large sections of his eccentric masterpiece to detailed demolitions of authors and works whose names are now almost completely forgotten, authors much more obscure today than even Stirner himself. Ironically, it seems clear that Stirner believed it would be precisely his tiresome discussion and criticism of these writers that would make his book a bestseller, because, after all, the writers he was criticizing were the cutting-edge young writers of the period. They were his colleagues and drinking companions, the notorious young Hegelians of Hippel's. And his contention that these supposedly advanced and liberated young intellectuals were actually just as mesmerized by fixed ideas of their own as the Christians and monarchists they thought they had put to rout. How could such a surefire analysis fail to attract public attention, particularly when it was combined with clever mockery, parody of the most elegant and discerning kind? For The Ego and Its Own is, in part, a parody, a send-up, if you will, of both Hegel and the young Hegelians who took themselves to be rebelling against him. David Leopold cites as evidence Stirner's treatment of Ludwig Feuerbach, the leading figure of the Hegelian left. The very structure of the book would have revealed Feuerbach as the primary target of Stirner's polemic to contemporary readers. The two parts of Stirner's book, headed Man and I, are an implicit structural parody of the sections God and Man of Feuerbach's best-known work, The Essence of Christianity, 1841. And this is part of the answer to the question, is Stirner serious? The answer is yes, he is, but only in part. Like all literary works of long-term importance, it has layers and levels. On one level, it's a great mocking of the left Hegelians, showing that their prized tripartite Hegelian analysis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, could be used to reach conclusions that stood their own fixed ideas on their heads. On another, it's a poetic statement or declaration, never an argument, about the nature of the human animal and the nature of human social relations. On yet another, it's a fantasy in which the unassuming Stirner lives his life as he would really like to, but can't. For the part of him that is serious is more an artist than a philosopher, at least as the philosopher is traditionally conceived, so that those who criticize his big book for contradicting itself and for rudely confronting its readers with unresolved and unresolvable logical conundrums are really missing the point. This is not to say, however, that there is no more to the ego and its own than what Honecker called Stirner's great revenge, the efflorescence of his ego, his romance, his dream of an ideal world. For, as John Carroll has argued, the life Stirner wrote about and the life he lived were in marked contrast. A drab and inconsequential reality was compensated for by assertive philosophy concerned with limitless human possibility. However, there is too much trenchant psychology in the ego and its own to identify its author as a daydreamer escaping from a society with whose practicalities he could not cope. In fact, according to Carroll, Stirner's work has retained its freshness and trenchancy through time, primarily because its radical political analysis is grounded in psychology. His best aphorisms bear that pungency which Nietzsche was to make his signature, an incisiveness which marks the accuracy of their probe into the sensitive tissue at the nucleus of human motivation. The locus of Stirner's interest is the individual psyche. He investigates the effects on this psyche of some of the ways men choose in their social context to pattern their behavior, and of the manner in which they then conceive of themselves. The ego and its own is a psychological philosophy of the growth of ego, of self-realization, and as such shares features with the Bildungsroman. Through its sustained, cyclically progressing monologue, meditating the vicissitudes of the unique individual, it develops an inner logic akin to that which endows the novels of character individuation with their fundamental coherence. The English historian of anarchism and biographer of anarchists, Peter Marshall, makes a very similar observation about the ego and its own without ever mentioning the word psychology. To Marshall, Stirner's eccentric masterpiece is unique in the history of philosophy. Its style is passionate, convoluted, and repetitive. Like a musical score, it introduces themes, drops them, only to develop them at a later stage. The whole adds up to a triumphant celebration of the joy of being fully oneself and in control of one's life, something Stirner himself never achieved. Yet if in fact the ego and its own is more like a psychological novel or a musical score than like any other work of philosophy published before the time of Friedrich Nietzsche, then perhaps it would be more appropriate to judge it by the standards suitable for judging a work of art, rather than by those suitable for judging a work of philosophy. Perhaps those who have done otherwise for the past 170 years have been, shall we say, uncomprehending. But from the beginning, incomprehension has been just about the only kind of comprehension Stirner's book has been able to attract. A few readers have understood it, true enough. I've quoted several of them in the past few minutes. I can report, however, that in my own case it wasn't until my third reading that I felt I really comprehended it. On my first two readings, I didn't understand enough about Stirner's historical and philosophical context to bring the desired act of comprehension off. I enjoyed his individualist rhetoric and his anti-state aphorisms. I read it again because, as the English anarchist Herbert Reed once put it, The Ego and Its Own is a book which, once read, is persistently recalled to memory. I wanted to bask in more of the delicious vitriol I recalled so clearly from my first reading. Needless to say, The Ego and Its Own was not a success in its time. It did not become a bestseller. It did not make Stirner any money. As has been seen, he eked out an increasingly meager existence by means of his journalism and his translating and editing in the years just following its publication. But by 1850 he had fallen silent, and in the few years that remained to him, David Leopold writes, he mainly expended his energies on continually moving to evade creditors, although not quickly enough to escape 2 brief periods in a debtor's prison. Finally, in late May 1856, he was bitten on the neck by an unidentified winged insect. The bite became infected, which in these days before antibiotics was no trivial matter. On the 25th of June, 4 months to the day before what would have been his 50th birthday, he died. He was penniless. 2 of his intellectual friends from the old days at Hippel's, Bruno Bauer and Ludwig Buhl, came forward to pay his burial expenses and witness his interment. Thereafter, as James Gibbons Huneker put it half a century later, Stirner was as absolutely swallowed up by the years as if he had never existed. He was rescued from obscurity in the first decade of the 20th century by John Henry Mackay, the German writer with the Scottish name, as he has been called, and Benjamin R. Tucker, who commissioned the first English translation of The Ego and Its Own, published it, and sold it in the pages of his magazine, Liberty, and in his unique bookshop in New York City. Tucker said in 1907 that, "I have been engaged for more than 30 years in the propaganda of anarchism, and have achieved some things of which I am proud, but I feel that I have done nothing for the cause that compares in value with my publication of this volume." That was Benjamin R. Tucker, and this is Jeff Riggenbach.
Thanks for listening to Liberty.me Studio. The views expressed on this show are not necessarily those of Liberty.me. Join the global Liberty community today at Liberty.me. Liberty lives here.